Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Stories to Watch 2022. I'm Michael Ulka. I'm the Acting Head of Communications for the World Resources Institute. WRI is a global organization that delivers solutions to improve people's lives and ensure that nature can thrive. We have around 1,500 staff working in 12 countries around the world. This is the 19th annual Stories to Watch, which has become a real highlight for the Institute. We look at the big moments, trends, and events in the coming year that will shape the world. Some things about Stories to Watch are the same this year, and some are different. As always, the idea behind Stories to Watch is not to predict the future. We are sharing our insights and ideas based on data and trends, and we are asking the question, what will these stories mean for our ability to get on a more sustainable path? The big difference this year is that Stories to Watch will be presented by our new president and CEO, Ani Dasgupta. Ani took on the role of president of WRI in June of 2021. He led our cities program for about 7 years. He's originally from Delhi, India, and Ani's a widely recognized leader in cities, in urban design, and poverty alleviation. We are thrilled that Ani is leading WRI to its next chapter. The other big difference this year is that we have pre-recorded the presentation, but don't worry, Ani is here. I've already seen him this morning, and he and our other top experts will be on hand during the live Q&A that will take place immediately after the presentation. Just a couple quick housekeeping notes. First, if you want to hear the presentation in French, Portuguese, or Spanish, you can hit the little interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. Second, please enter your questions into the Q&A box. You can enter questions throughout the presentation. We'll give you written answers. And again, we'll take some of those into the panel discussion at the end. Third, please keep the conversation going. Use the hashtag STW2022 if you're on social media. And lastly, we will be sharing the full presentation, the slide deck, and a lot of related materials on our website. You can find that at wri.org. So please check that out after the event. So having taken care of those details, I'm now pleased to unveil Stories to Watch 2022 with Ani Dasgupta. Please sit back and enjoy the presentation.
Welcome. Welcome to the 2022 version of Stories to Watch. My name is Ani Dasgupta. I'm the CEO and president of WRI. If you've been to one of these events before, welcome back. If you're new to WRI, we are a global research organization based all over the world with the mission to solve and find solutions to the world's most difficult problems facing environment and our society. We do that by bringing the best science and the practical knowledge of how things get done on the ground together, by bringing solutions that can be scaled. When we started doing this in early 2000, as you can imagine, we were trying to introduce topics of climate change to the broader society. We would do it in a room, maybe with a dozen journalists, with the hope they write stories about climate change during the year. But things have really changed. Our objective today is not to tell you new things that you don't know about. We're going to talk about 6 issues that we know you know about, and most probably you'll come across with your work, or during a newspaper, or in debates. Our objective is to share with you the big picture of these issues, but also the details that are missed. The work I'm presenting is a collective work of our team, but also work of our whole community. And you will notice that though there are 6 stories, the interconnected nature of these stories, that it's not just about climate or carbon, it's actually about economy, our health, our economic well-being, our jobs. And this, as we go forward, is a positive change, that we are seeing these issues not as isolated issues of carbon and carbon reduction, but actually shifts of societal change that needs to take place. But before we jump into the stories, we should take a minute to reflect the year we've had. This has been quite a year. The pandemic, of course, we are living in a third year of the pandemic. This has disrupted everyone's life. Everyone here, you're listening, your life's been touched somehow. Every economy in the world has been touched by the pandemic. I can't believe I'm going to be working from home the third running year. This year has also been a year of political division. Early last year, we saw this picture in every television screen and newspaper. So, a mob attacking the capital of the United States. The divisions like this took place all over the world. The COVID also caused serious supply chain disruption. You remember this famous picture of this Ever Given. That was the name of the ship, stuck in Suez Canal, not for a day, but for weeks at end. The supply chain disruptions also caused energy shocks across the world. Rolling blackouts in China, 5 times high price of gas in Europe, inflation. And impacts of climate change are here. Across the world this whole year, we are seeing one event after another. This particular photograph is from a few weeks back in Colorado. Forest fire in the middle of winter. In Chile, we had a 13-year drought, one of the most severe in 1,000 years of the history of Chile. 400,000 people had to get water trucked into them. Similarly, in Brazil, just north of Chile, it's a drought and flooding cycle that caused the worst disaster in the state's history. Other regions, Europe, India, Sudan, faced very similar events. And the inequity that was displayed by how vaccine was distributed in the world in 2021-22 is shocking. The richest countries in the world, the higher income countries, 71% of population is vaccinated. At the same time, in the low income countries, only 7%. And last year, we saw a dip in our emissions because of lack of economic activity because of COVID. So we are kind of hopeful that the dip will continue. We were actually hopeful the economic recovery will be green after COVID. That didn't happen. As soon as the economies turned back, the emissions rose very quickly. With all this not so good news, the year was not all bad. There were a lot of really bright spots. Countries, cities, and companies across the world made very significant commitments to tackle climate change. This is not a series of commitments. We think this is actually a shift of taking climate change as an event that is inevitable, it's happening, and taking it seriously and making concrete commitments towards solving it. 155 countries submitted NDCs or their plans to reduce carbon. 83 countries announced net zero targets. 1,000 cities committed to net zero and reducing the emission to 50% by end of this decade. 2,000 plus companies had science-based target or verified targets to get to net zero. All this came together in Glasgow in November. These commitments were important commitments were made in Glasgow. But more than that, I felt Glasgow itself, the fact that countries came back after Paris, not all countries did it, not as much as we wanted, but the fact they came back matters a lot. I think this was the biggest achievement in the COP. In this era, when everyone is questioning multilateralism, our ability to work together as a society, countries to solve the world's biggest problem, this corner of multilateralism is working. There were very important commitments, and each of these commitments matter, because when we were in Paris, we were a world that was leading to 3.6 degrees. Now, we're in a world that's leading to 2.8 degrees, a significant change. Not enough. And if you take all the commitments countries, companies have made to net zero and they actually implemented it, we will get to 1.9 degrees. Not 1.5 degrees, but close. We would get to right. We need to do more, but we are moving in the right direction. So, the meta question, the big question we have across all the 6 stories you'll hear, is all these good commitments, will we be able to turn this commitment into real world action? That is the question for this year. The first story is about net zero. Net zero is a big idea of commitment to getting and reducing carbon by 2050. You hear a lot about it. However, at the same time, people are questioning credibility of this commitment. Why is that? Why such a good idea of reducing carbon by 2050 is being questioned? The science of climate change is becoming better and better every day. And it's absolutely clear by the best scientists in the world, who are represented by the IPCC, that to limit global warming beyond 1.5 degrees, beyond 1.5 degrees, the impacts become exponentially bad. What does net zero mean? And why is it net? And why is it not zero? Let me introduce to our bathtub. I'm sure you were expecting a bathtub in this conversation. Imagine the bathtub as our environment, and the water flowing into is the emission we are producing today. And if we continue to do what we're doing, we will keep filling up the bathtub, and soon it'll overflow, and we'll reach 1.5 degree. So, what do we need to do to get a place that the bathtub doesn't overflow? One, we need to reduce the amount of water we're putting in it. That's the most important thing to do. Second, we need to make sure the size of the drain is big enough so the same as what water we're putting in, so the level of water remains the same on the top of this bathtub. That is what net zero is. Our amount of carbon emission we're putting in is the same as the carbon emission we're taking out of our atmosphere. Actually, this idea is gaining a lot of ground. It started in Bhutan in 2015, one country. But today, there are 83 countries who have made net zero commitment, which means they have committed to get the economies to a place that the carbon they're producing in 2050 will be same as the carbon they're taking out. This is enormous progress. Similarly, 1,000 cities have pledged to reach net zero by 2050 or sooner. 750 companies have committed to net zero through science-based targets. Yet, a wide skepticism remains on this idea. Why is there a skepticism? I think the most important part of the skepticism, the fact is 2050 is 28 years away. It seems it's very far away that we're making commitment, we're making excuses not to do something today by making a long-term commitment. It lacks accountability, that the commitments are not verifiable, that we don't know if people actually mean it. It also seems like we're shifting responsibility from doing something today and letting someone else 20 years from now take the responsibility of taking it out. This skepticism for a very important idea like net zero is very corrosive. So how do we make them credible? I think it's relatively straightforward how to make these commitments credible. We think these commitments are actually very important. One, focus on near-term action. Don't just make a plan for the long-term shift. You have to get to a place of zero carbon by 2050 or net zero by 2050. We have to take action today, tomorrow, day after. Near-term action is the most important thing we can do to increase credibility. Second, have plans, but have verifiable plans. Make sure it's transparent, the progress you're making, so that people have confidence that not only that you're making plans, that you're making progress that everyone can see. This year, will net zero commitment gain credibility? And we think this is very important because the commitment itself is very important. And having people believe in them, believe in this commitment, is very important for us to make progress. Many countries have raised ambition for net zero. G20 countries, the richest countries in the world, almost all of them have made some kind of a pledge to net zero, from exploring, for political pledges, policies. Some, like EU, Canada, Japan, UK, have turned them into actual action. However, some, like China, have made a very significant commitment to net zero 2060, yet their plans for 2030 was not as ambitious as what people wanted to see. So this year, would China rise up and make the 2030 plans much more credible? Countries like Australia and Brazil have made 2050 commitments, but not 2030 commitments. Hence, people are not sure about their plan to reduce carbon or their ability to get to net zero without a 2030 plan. And finally, would we see Mexico join this club and create a net zero plan. There's a great opportunity this coming year. There's a G20 summit in Bali that Indonesia is hosting, one of the more important global south country, very important in climate change. It's an opportunity to showcase what a global south country and the transition plan could be. We know Indonesia has very significant plans of the transition, including energy transition. So it's a very important thing to watch for. What do G20 countries do? Because these countries together actually produce 75% of global emission. So actions they take can have an impact beyond the boundaries of these countries. Every country matters. The policies they take in every country matters. So right now, in US Senate, there is a very important bill that includes $500 billion of climate change activities. These activities, if implemented, will allow United States to get to 2030 with 50% reduction. Will companies will have made very important pledges and commitments this year. Would they make progress against their goals? Last year, and WRI was a very important part of it, the first net zero standards was released for companies. 750 companies committed to this. Will we see an exponential rise of doubling this number or tripling this number of companies that have credible net zero commitment? Finally, will financial institutions get out of supporting fossil fuels? Last year at COP, there was a very significant announcement of a group of financial companies that actually together control $130 trillion. I repeat, $130 trillion. I don't think I have used $130 trillion in a sentence before this happened. I don't know how many of you done. This is a very significant commitment. To not only is a commitment, it's important not only because of net zero, because this idea that if we stop the spigot that funds fossil fuel industry, if we stop that, maybe that'll be the fastest way to get to a net zero world. And if this money that is not going to fossil fuel start going to renewable energy, we will see exponential development in this field. Would this organization that's committed, would they follow through? The next story is after coal. Will be transitioned while avoiding disruption and keeping the lights on. Coal actually has been politically polarizing. The science of it, the economics of it, clearly shows a path of getting out of coal. However, it hasn't been easy for countries where coal is an important source of energy. The country I come from, in India, still 70% of energy or electricity comes from coal, or people whose jobs, whose livelihood depend on coal. This transition hasn't been easy. Something so obvious, seems science says it's so clear. Why is not the transition easy? Or what can we do to make it smoother? This is an important point this year, because how we successfully manage the transition from coal to cleaner energy is a very good barometer, metric, how will we do in other energy transition we need. So let's look into this issue that seems so obvious, why it's so difficult. It's clear why people want to talk about coal, why it seems coal is the obvious place to start. It is a very important part of the energy. 25% of energy still comes from coal today. And it is also the most polluting of the fuels. So naturally, we have to take care of coal, oil, gas, but it seems coal is reasonably the right place to start. And none of the scientific analysis of modeling to 1.5 degree centigrade world includes coal as a fuel. Almost every model shows that we have to get out of coal or phase out of coal by 2030. There's a lot of agreement on this across the world. In COP this year, 46 countries agreed to phase out domestic coal, use of domestic coal. 34 countries agreed not to invest in overseas coal. China was one of them. It's a very important declaration. The economics is in favor. Everywhere in the world, if you wanted to put up a plant that produces electricity, setting up a plant that is renewable, offshore wind, solar PV, or any of this above, will be cheaper than setting up a plant that is coal-fired. Good news. Similarly, the overall mix of energy produced from coal compared to energy produced from clean energy, its clean energy is going up. And the coal actually had a little bit upswing last year, but overall it's going down. Still, it's a long way to go from where we are today to phasing out coal completely by 2030. So while costs are no longer an obstacle, why are there barriers? The barriers are serious. The serious technical and political challenges are in front of it. And when you think about it, it's happening in a context of increasing demand from energy. 24% increase in demand of energy has happened just the last decade. And this is expected to continue. As countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia grow, of course, or urbanize, the energy demand will increase. So think about getting out of an important source of energy while energy demand is increasing. It is also happening when 760 million people today do not have reliable access to electricity. This number is actually much better than it was 10 years back. 1.2 billion people did not have access to energy. We're making progress, but still a long way to go. So when you think of transition of coal, you have to think of the context of energy demand and making sure we reach the people who don't have electricity today. So how will we make sure this transition, which seems inevitable right now, how do we make sure the transition happens? In the smooth, just, meaning people who don't have energy get energy, people who have jobs that depend on it actually are taken care of, and resilient, so that it's a predictable system that political leaders can support. How do we make sure that happens? So things to watch for. Will the coal project, investment in coal, it's been a good sign over the last few years, has gone down steadily. New projects that are pipelined, permitted, actually is going up. Will that trend continue? The investments in coal will reduce. Remember, a coal-fired plant lives for 30, 40 years. The plant that's built in 2014 will still be there in 2044. Will the countries, the biggest coal user, commit to phasing it out? I think this is one of the more important things to watch out for. Some of the countries like EU, South Korea, Germany, have committed in Vietnam to getting out of coal. But the countries that are the biggest users, China, India, United States, Japan, would they commit to phase out coal? For countries like India and China, this is a significant issue. I've already mentioned 70% of electricity is dependent on coal today. In China, it's 61%. In South Africa, it's 86%. Will these countries commit to phase out? And would the world support this commitment? As we're thinking out taking coal out of the system, would the investment in renewable be fast enough to keep up and meet the gap that the coal sticks out? The annual renewable construction needs to be tripling for what is happening today. Will multilateral finance like ADB, the Asian Development Bank, or the World Bank support these phase out? Asian Development Bank actually has a very innovative program that invests directly to take existing coal-fired plants offline. Would that be successful? Would that continue to catch on? Will China increase renewable finance? As they stop financing coal, they have been financing renewable for a while. Would they increase it? Will all countries, especially poorer countries that are being hit by COVID, would they have the fiscal resources to invest in renewable energy in the post-pandemic world? As we invest in renewable, would the grid be ready? The estimates are 70% more investment needed in grid per year in the next decade. Why is that the case? Not only transmission needs to be stable, storage, which will become a very important part as renewable becomes an important part of the supply. Would it be there? Would the demand response of the change in demand that's taking place, would that happen? The US infrastructure bill that passed last year had $5 billion for grid expenditure and $6 billion for reliability. These are the kind of investments we need to make the grid up to the mark in the new world of renewable energy. Most importantly, Will the people whose livelihood, 7 million people, are dependent on coal or coal-related industry for their livelihood and their families, would they be taken care of? Would the transition be fair to them? You and 26 other countries have mentioned just transition in the decarbonization plan. South Africa just agreed to $8.5 billion deal to get out of coal. Would those transitions be fair? This fairness is not just a question of being morally right. Of course it is morally right. But this fairness is also very important for making these transitions politically viable so that other countries follow. So how we actually take coal transition, a fuel, as you can see from the economics and science of it, has the most support. Would we make this transition smooth, avoiding disruption, make it politically viable? This will be a litmus test if we can manage energy transition on this one. Well, because there are other transitions that will follow. The third of our climate story is very connected to the fairness of transition. It's about climate justice. You'll hear a lot about this, and we are very happy that climate justice has been discussed in a widespread way across the world. This is not a new topic. A lot of people, especially people of color, organizations across the world have been working on climate justice for years. And because of their work, today there's recognition of the topic and feeling that we should be discussing it in a wider way in the context of climate change. Listening to frontline communities is a critical part of getting to justice. One of the best quotes I have seen is from Vanessa Nakate, the Ugandan climate activist. And she says, how can we have climate justice if the people who are suffering the worst impacts of climate crisis are not being listened to, are not being platformed, not being amplified, and are left out of the conversation? It is not possible. It is not possible to talk about justice or climate justice if the people who are impacted by it is not part of the conversation. Climate justice among countries and within countries. Among countries, you can think about who caused the problem, which countries actually produce most of the emission that we see in the atmosphere. It's pretty obvious which countries. The countries that are developed, that have used fossil fuel for decades, for centuries, to get to where they are. North America, Europe, parts of Asia. Then you can ask yourself, okay, which countries then are impacted by this emission? This picture looks very different. The countries that are impacted are very different countries. The countries mostly in global south. This difference is not accidental geographically. It's also connected of centuries of colonialism. Who is most affected within countries are also impacted by historic division. Communities that have been economically and socially marginalized, especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color, are impacted more by climate impacts. Why is that? Think about what is a climate impact. It is lack of water. It's flooding. It's your inability to build on the land you have, or ability to actually produce food on land that is degraded, or air you can't breathe because it's polluted. Each one of these impacts causes scarcity. Scarcity of land, scarcity of food, scarcity of buildable space. And when there is a scarcity, the poor, the marginalized, always get impacted. So our historic divisions actually repeat itself. When we talk about climate, we have to talk about people and the injustices they are in the middle of. Mary Robinson says, climate justice insists on a shift, and I repeat, a shift, from a discourse of greenhouse gases and melting ice caps into a civil rights movement with the people and communities most vulnerable to the climate impact at its heart. She's asking for a shift of us thinking about climate in a different way, away from the science of it, which is very important. The science is actually better than ever, to a world where we think about people who are impacted by it. As you can imagine, climate justice, or justice in general, is a multidimensional problem, plays out differently because exclusion exists everywhere in the world, but it exists differently. The ways to think about it is, impacts. They're unequally distributed, as you saw from the map. Unequal responsibilities. People who are causing it, people who are supposed to solve it, and resources to solve it is unequally distributed. Rich countries have much more resources than the poorer countries who are getting the impact. And similarly, our power to solve it, our resources that we have to deal with it, it's unequally distributed. Each one of these issues could be dealt much more deeply to understand climate justice. The result of getting it right, we think, in every case, is whether we are actually focusing on local action. Are people who are getting impacted by it, would they have more resources, more power to make decisions on how to solve it? Obviously, this is more equitable, it's morally right. But it turns out, at least the evidence shows, that it is also more effective. That poorer communities who have been dealing with lack of resources all their lives for centuries actually have ideas and solutions to deal with it. So the climate problem that creates scarcity, poorer communities are better equipped to deal with it. It's more effective. It also benefits everyone. So will we see a real shift in thinking of climate, not just as an issue of carbon, but an issue of justice and power, and the rights and finances that it gets to local level? Will we see a shift to the way we solve this problem, the way we frame this problem? What to watch for? 70 organized 6 countries in the world committed to local adaptation principles. This is a very good thing. But the proof of the pudding would be if the money flows in this direction. The goal is to get 25% of climate finance to locally led adaptation. Right now, it's a tiny percentage. Would we see a real shift? Would we see a recognition of loss of damage? What is loss of damage? Some place in the world, climate impacts are so severe, it's not possible to adapt anymore, not possible to recover. Will we see finance for loss and damage? This has been a controversial topic. In Glasgow, there was some glimmer of hope. Actually, loss and damage for the first time was included in the formal text. And then again, this year, there's a meeting on Glasgow Dialogue on loss and damage. Would we see more progress in Egypt in the next COP? And would we stop debates, or will we go beyond debates of who's liable and who needs to be compensated? That is holding back real progress. 177 countries supported finance of loss and damage in Glasgow, but major countries opposed it. So we did not make the progress we wanted. Would we see a shift and a major focus in the next COP? Will support grow for locally led ecosystem restoration? This is more important in Africa than anywhere else. There's a very important program in Africa called A400 that seeks to restore 100 million hectares of degraded land. Local communities in Africa manage over 70% of Africa's land. Would we see not only the goal of raising $2 billion for the restoration, but this finances actually going to local communities that is impacted, and local organization, grassroots groups that are working on it? Similarly, indigenous people hold and manage at least half of the world's land. Yet, only 10% are legally recognized as belonging to them. Securing land rights for indigenous people has direct social and environmental benefits. A very good example is Kenya. Kenya has a land tenure law that recognizes indigenous people's rights. Would we see more of it? Would we see that law getting implemented? That's why the $1.7 billion committed in COP26 towards indigenous people and making sure that gets implemented properly is critical to make progress. Policies in every country will matter. The United States right now has very ambitious plans in place of providing 40% of climate investment benefits will reach disadvantaged communities. If this plan passes into law, there's a lot to watch for. How they will be selected, what kind of pilot programs will be done, how will we evaluate success. This is not just another topic. This is actually a shift in how we think about this problem. The thinking about climate beyond carbon towards people and impact of people who are getting suffering most, and making sure that the injustice that's already there in society doesn't get replicated in climate solutions. The exclusion, the racism that is embedded in our society is actually dealt with and recognized as we find new solutions for the new world, for the new economy. So not to watch for, not only for this year, for years to come. Our next story is about deforestation. The world has been trying to reverse deforestation for a long time. This year, there is a reason for hope. One of the biggest commitments ever made for deforestation was in COP on the second day. I was there actually in the room. 141 leaders of 141 countries made commitments to stop deforestation completely by 2030. $19.2 billion was pledged to work on this topic. It was really funny to see, not funny, but just funny, to see 141 world leaders, mostly men, one after another, trying to outdo each other how much they love forests and trees. We just hope this trend continues. It's good to see such enthusiasm for nature. Why do we worry about deforestation? Tropical forests are essential for 1.5 degrees. If tropical tree cover loss was a country, it would be the second biggest country on carbon emission, just after China, above United States and India. There are actually 7 commodities that are the main reason for deforestation. First of them is actually cattle. If you have a car and it has leather seat, think about where that leather came from. Did it come from deforestation sources? Think about the shampoo you're using. Almost all these hair products, all these products we use, includes palm oil. Did it come from a deforestation source that is not responsible for deforestation? You can look at all the other things that are things that we use every day. It's not just a problem for those countries where the forests are. To solve it, we have to come together and solve it together. The consequence of deforestation are very clear and devastating. From forest fires in the Amazon because of deforestation or taking away indigenous communities' land, biodiversity loss, it's very obvious, to large-scale flooding in Indonesia that is because of deforestation that's taking place. In spite of this evidence, the sad truth is that this is not the first time the world is coming together to solve this problem. In New York in 2014, countries came together called the New York Declaration to reduce forest deforestation, actually eliminate it by 2030 and reduce it by half by 2020. In reality, actually primary forest loss went up 41% during this time. Our research shows this is a problem that is persistent. It's been there for a long time because gone up actually in recent past, but it is steadily there. We have not been able to make a dent on this. So the question is, this year, will action in 2022, because what I just told you happened, 141 countries, $19 million, will the world be on course to halt deforestation for 2030? Will we see a real shift in the way we're dealing with this and make progress? The most encouraging sign to watch for is shift in mindset. Will we see a sea change in how we think about this? Chai Suri, a phenomenal 24-year-old activist from the Amazon, was at the COP. I had the privilege to listen to her. And she says, the earth is speaking. She tells us that we have no more time. We need a different path with both local and global changes. It is not 2030 or 2050, it is now. She's telling us that we have to take action now, and it's not just local action. The world has to work together with local communities to make progress. This recognition of importance of our natural systems and our forest and our climate goal is one of the biggest things to watch for. And we think we are going in the right direction. will consumers and countries where most of these consumers live choose commodity markets or close commodity markets that link to deforestation? Will EU pass legislation to curb imports linked to deforestation? Will China work with companies to ensure deforestation-free imports? Was the US government-led initiative, Forest Investor Club, take hold and make progress? Will the countries where the forests are take concerted action, not only at the national level, where they need to prevent illegal clearing, tackle corruption, make no deforestation goals a central part of the economic plan, but not only will they work on national part, but also focus on communities on the ground, secure land rights and create opportunities for local communities, so the communities can depend on a successful future without deforestation or economies that support deforestation. The next things to watch: will companies use tracking to take deforestation out of supply chains? Significant progress is made technologically for us to be able to track supply chain deforestation. Forest Positive Coalition, a coalition of the largest companies like Walmart, Nestle, Unilever, Mars, have come together to make sure all their suppliers are deforestation free. Would we see progress like this across the world in other supply chains? Will financial support, the $19 billion pledge, or $19.5 billion pledge, will this support not just protecting forests, but real transition on those communities that are dependent on forest? Will those funds actually reach the front lines who are impacted by deforestation? And finally, most importantly, will demand for high-quality forest carbon credits grow? This is a huge area that could go right or maybe not so right. But if it went right, we will see companies, things like Leaf Coalition, expand. And companies participating in this do so when they have done the most in making sure they have limiting carbon emission themselves. And the finances go to communities that are impacted by it, indigenous communities, and finances go to not only protect forests, but to make sure the communities transition successfully. Stopping deforestation is a critical need. It's critical for 1.5 degrees, critical for all the people who live around our tropical forest. This has been a hard problem to solve. We have an opportunity this year to make a real dent with real political commitment and real finance behind it, and potentially more finance to follow with high-quality carbon credits. Will this year be a turning point for reversing deforestation? The next story is about preventing pandemics. And you will be surprised that we have included a story of public health in the middle of stories of climate and climate impact. Turns out the science is getting better on this, and there's a real significant connection between how the natural systems work and how and when pandemics take place. So will the world take action now to stop the next global pandemic? How do pandemics start? Zoonotic spillovers, the transmission of pathogens from animals to humans, leads up to 75% of infectious disease. All of them are not pandemics, but most of them come from that. And drivers of spillover are kind of obvious. You know, insects is one, direct connection with wild animals and humans, illegal trade, and also through domestic animals. The surprising thing is these spillover events are happening more than ever and happening all over the world. It's from Latin America to Australia, the incidences are all over. And these incidences are rising. Pandemics are not anymore once-in-a-lifetime events. There's increasing frequency, increasing severity. Hundreds of thousands of spillover events happen annually. Most are inconsequential. Some lead to disease. Recent ones like Ebola, H1N1, Zika, and of course COVID-19, and so many more. These are examples of what happens from the spillover. You're all aware of the enormous cost of pandemics. We're all living through it. All of us are impacted by it. 5.4 million people are dead because of COVID-19. A healthy Earth requires fewer pandemics. Our current global pandemic strategy has been of reaction: mass, social distancing, vaccination, stopping going to work, crowded spaces. Turns out, we actually know how to prevent pandemics. We have to protect forests, regulate live wildlife trade, reduce human-wildlife contact, invest in public health and disease hotspots. These all seem rather obvious. Why isn't it happening? One of the reasons it's not happening is people who think about forest and wildlife are different kind of people who think of public health and pandemics. That these silos are not actually working together yet. And there are vast inequities in healthcare access. And because pandemic causes such economic disruption, just the one that we're in the middle of, it is a strong political issue. And political reality as a timeline makes decisions on how to take care of public health rather than the science, what's behind them. Then, of course, people ask, can we afford it? Turns out, it'll only take, I don't say only lightly, only take $22 to $31 billion per year to protect forests and regulate animal trade. At the same time, just in the United States, we spend $100 billion in pet care. I'm a pet owner, I have nothing against pets, but just think about these two numbers. So, the question is, can public health and environmental sectors work together to prevent pandemics before they begin? Will that happen? What needs to happen for this outcome to take place? Will the global pandemic treaty emerge? World Health Assembly in March and August is a huge opportunity to bring these two sectors together, to think about pandemic in the most systematic way. Will governments adopt a global biodiversity framework? There's a UN Biodiversity Conference in April and May. Will that take the approach not only of biodiversity and nature, but its connection to public health? And will vulnerable communities get the healthcare they need? There's really exciting emerging science. This is a new research, this particular one for Indonesia, where it shows investment in specific communities next to tropical forests on healthcare results in reducing deforestation. There's a direct correlation between deforestation and the quality of public health. This story is about changing our frame of mind, how we think about pandemics, and how to bring two very important communities that work on forest and wildlife and biodiversity, and the public health community together to solve and prevent the next pandemic. Our next story is about electric cars. You will hear a lot about electric cars. It's everywhere. There's a lot of momentum, a lot of enthusiasm in this area. The question really is, would we be able to use this momentum of electrification transportation to make a real dent in the climate crisis? The case for decarbonizing transport is pretty straightforward. Transport today is 24% of energy-related CO2 emissions. To limit warming to 1.5 degrees, we need a 90% cut in transport CO2 by 2050. This is a sector has been really a laggard in the sectors in making progress. And it's a little embarrassing. I kind of feel responsible. I've been working in the sector for many years. The story of EV is exponential growth. Last year, there were 5.6 million vehicles sold. Year before, it was 3.1. We think this curve is about to go up. There are more models hitting the road every day. There are more than 500 electric vehicles that you can purchase today. The first one is an interesting one, the picture of Ford Lightning. I actually don't recommend all of you buy a truck. But the fact that this is the best-selling vehicle in the United States, and that is becoming electric. And recently, in a conversation with a Ford official, he told me that when it comes to market, 200,000 of such vehicles have been booked already before a single one has hit the market. The next vehicle, Rivian, is like Tesla, it's from scratch, electric vehicle from scratch. They're valued at more than $100 billion today. They haven't produced any vehicles yet. So the market is supporting this. And Sony, that was famous for Walkman, is going to make electric cars. So this is a market full of interesting development, but most important, real momentum. Countries are following suit. Countries, regions, national government across the world are putting in policy to phase out internal combustion engines, to welcome electric vehicles. And it's not just focused only on cars. Personal mobility, scooters, cycles are getting electrified. Last year, actually, the world sold more electric cycles than ever before. Buses are getting electrified. This is Shenzhen, China. 100% buses in Shenzhen, China are electric. There's development in heavy trucks, semis, electric semis in California. But this is just actually, all this momentum, all this euphoria is really a beginning of a revolution. Today, if you look at all the cars there are, the whole fleet, it's only 1% electric. What we need is actually much more acceleration. By 2030, we need 30% of our fleet electric. And by 2050, we need 92.5% of all vehicles electric. The interesting thing about this slide, of this picture, is not only the green color, is actually the number of cars there are. There are 1.2 billion cars in the world today. And if you didn't do anything else, there'll be more than 2 billion cars in the world by 2050. So cars alone, just think about it, producing all those cars will not get us there, get us all the way there. Actually, electrification can get us a lot of the way there, 83% there. But to get to really reducing 90% emission, we need to do more than just electrification. We need to get people out of cars, into public transport, into walking and biking. So the real question is, in this really good story, that would be build on the momentum for electrification and decarbonize the transport sector. What does need to happen for that to happen? What to watch for? The first, of course, how do we accelerate the pace of adoption of electrification of vehicles? Will government policy speed electrification? Will we follow the example of China that has taken electrification as a national policy in every level, national, province, city, has supported electrification in multiple ways? China has the biggest fleet of electric vehicles right now. Would other countries follow China as a focused policy at the national level? Will we see, as we see in countries in Europe phasing out internal combustion engines, would we see that implemented and expanding? Will US see more electric buses and electric school buses? This is one of my favorite ones. The United States has more than 475,000 school buses, more than any other country in the world. We are in the middle of a program fully supported by the Biden administration to electrify all the school buses in this decade. We think this is possible. This is what we want. We want our children to breathe cleaner air, to see the benefit of electric mobility, to grow up thinking electric mobility is the new normal. It's not just cars that need to get electrified. Would we see the infrastructure that needs to develop to charge those cars? So what is called range anxiety, we will actually hear less of it because a lot more cars have a lot more ranges. Would we have charging stations where we need them? And more importantly, to see the real benefit of electrification, would we have the energy that's getting into the car, that making sure that is clean? But as this revolution takes place, as we make more and more electric cars, we have to watch out for unintended consequences. As the electric vehicle expands, think about all the things that needs to go in it. Just let's focus on the batteries, just the batteries. The batteries today require rare earths, lithium, cobalt, things like that. As the number of vehicles increase, even today, there's serious abuse of environmental abuses because of extraction of this materials, but also human rights abuses because a lot of these rare earths are in very poor countries. Would we make sure as the demand grows that we manage in a way that we don't cause the environmental problem or the conflict and abuse that's taking place of people who are extracting this mineral. I'm just talking about batteries. I'm not only talking about steel that's required in these vehicles, or the water that's required to produce this. So we have to make sure as we expand that, we don't create new problems that will need solutions in the future. And how do we make sure we take people out of cars into public transport? To meet the 2030 climate goal, we have to reduce use of private cars or light-duty vehicles by 4 to 14%. Think about that for a minute. Countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, China, where growth is taking place, the demand of car is actually increasing. So we need to reverse the demand, stop it and reverse it. At the same time, we need to shift trips in cities to walking and bicycle. We have to increase by 50%. And we have to increase public transport capacity by 50%. And fundamentally, to make real shift, we need to build cities that just doesn't require us to travel far, require us mechanical transportation. We will need cities like Copenhagen, Bogota, and Melbourne that are walkable, bikeable. And you would think that takes a lot of time. That's a long-term goal. Actually, during pandemic, during the economic downturn, cities across the world, these cities and many more, took the opportunity to build infrastructure for walking and biking. Bogota built, I think, 100 or 200 kilometers more of bicycle lane that didn't exist before. So would we see, as we've come out of the pandemic, that these plans actually are implemented and goes forward and not reverse back as the economy recovers? This is a huge opportunity for us. There's a real momentum for electric transportation. And would we use this momentum to create a real dent in the climate crisis by taking carbon out of transportation? These choices we make this year will have impact not only this decade, but our ability to get to a net zero by 2050. These will be discussed and debated. And that's good. And we hope you will be, therefore, actively participating in this discussion and ask questions. These are not neutral positions. All these stories are connected to each other. It's about the future where we need to be, a future that is not only decarbonized, but also good for people and good for nature. Thank you for being here. And not only thank you for being here, we hope you join us in the journey to get to a more fairer, more low carbon, and more thriving world where nature and humans can thrive together. Thank you for being here. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining. I'm really looking forward to a lively discussion. Thank you all for all the questions that you've already submitted. Please continue to do so. Use the Q&A function on the bottom of the screen to ask questions. We are trying to answer as many as we can online, but we also want to ask our group of experts. We have a very lively group of experts that's on your screen that have joined us and many more online. So I'll try to do justice to all the questions you have. Just to jump right in, I think the first question I want to bring Jennifer. Jennifer Layke is our head of our energy program. And Jennifer, you've seen the question. I'll just read it out for our audience here. Jennifer, the question is, if the demand for energy will increase, will renewable energies be enough? Is it important to also have an energy consumption reduction model? What commitments are there in this regard? What do you think, Jennifer? Over to you.
Thank you for the question, and wonderful to see you all here today. It is essential that we do two things simultaneously: decarbonize the electricity supply and help support the change in the trajectory of energy demand. And that doesn't mean leaving people out of the clean energy transition. What it does mean is that we need to focus on bringing energy efficient solutions to market rapidly, allowing people to reduce the amount of money they spend on energy and simultaneously offering them improved quality of life, homes that are well insulated, and technologies that help to make this transition possible for them and their families. So we know that energy efficiency is lagging dramatically behind investments in supply and must be a focus for policymakers.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Chip and Franz, I'm going to go next. It's an excellent question on emission and biodiversity. The question is, one of the signature carbon emission is from loss of biodiversity from land use change. We have enough data and remote sensing technology to identify the problem and the potential of the remedy. A scientific-based analysis and resolution need to be promoted. The question is asking Chip, what's your comment on the data and the correlation in biodiversity and climate? Chip, I'm going to go to you first. Chip is the Director of Forest Legality Initiative in WRI and a Senior Advisor on Biodiversity. Chip, you first, and then I'll come to Francis.
Sure, thank you, Ani. Yeah, the problems of climate change and biodiversity are very much linked when we look at the forests, particularly the tropical forests. And it's correct on the question that we have a lot of good data and information to show us where these two issues come together. And the problem is that information by itself won't lead to action. You need that political will that you were talking about earlier in the presentation. And we need to really focus on the underlying conditions that will allow investment and protection. If we don't deal with problems of illegal clearing and logging and corruption, as was raised in another question, it's going to be very difficult to get the kind of investment that we really need. And we need to defend and protect Indigenous peoples and their communities who are really the front line of dealing with this problem. And finally, just getting the resources to these high forest, low deforestation countries that are big reservoirs and sponges of carbon out there is very important, both for biodiversity and for addressing our climate challenge.
Thanks a lot, Chip. Francis, I want to go to you. Francis, you've been thinking about this a lot. It's actually an excellent question of where the data is. Francis Seymour is a senior fellow at WRI. Francis, over to you.
Thanks, Ani. No, I think the questioner has really pointed out one of the big changes in the last 10 years, which is the availability of satellite data and other remote sensing tools that our colleagues at Global Forest Watch have put to great use. So now not only can we pinpoint where forest loss and degradation is happening, we increasingly can say why it's happening and trace it to specific agents. And furthermore, we can do analysis that tells us what interventions are most effective to stop it. And so we actually have quite good evidence now about what needs to be done, as has been suggested. Recognize the rights of Indigenous territories. You know, we can see from space where the boundaries of Indigenous management end. We can enforce the law, where so much of this forest loss and degradation is actually being done illegally. It's theft of state assets or theft of community assets. And, you know, governments can avoid building roads into intact forests, you know, to both reduce emissions and protect biodiversity. But I want to stress that a lot of the things that need to be done can be done with the help of the international community. And as Ani described, a lot of this forest loss is being driven by our demand for these commodities. And so by providing positive market signals, a preference in trade for products that are legally and sustainably produced, we can help align the incentives of those governments. And we can also provide finance, both upfront finance for the kinds of things that need to be done on the ground, but also performance-based finance. And that's where REDD+ comes in, and what Ani mentioned about the role of forest carbon credits in high integrity carbon markets to actually provide the finance for those interventions that have been effective.
Thank you very much, Francis. Excellent. Claudia, I want to go to you next. Claudia leads our urban mobility program globally and been working on road safety and health for many, many years. Claudia, this is a question I think is designed for you. And the question is, shouldn't COP26 have encouraged public transportation and active mobility as part of the solution to reduce emissions? From the final statement on transportation, it appears that electrifying all the motor vehicles is the only possible solution that by itself would be sufficient, viable, and feasible. Claudia, what do you think?
Hi, Annie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. The answer is yes. COP26 should have been a little wider, and I think you, Annie, in Stories to Watch on urban mobility have touched on to that. If we make the numbers, we are not going to get to 2050 with the reduction in carbon emissions if we use a silver bullet. Electrifying vehicles is absolutely key, but so is to have mass transportation, walking and cycling. Now, different countries have also different solutions. In Latin America, Asia, and Africa, 90% of people walk, bike, or take mass transportation. So we have to respond to the needs of them, giving them affordable, high quality, and safe mass transportation, walking and cycling that is not in place in this moment. So we need a system approach, Annie, and I completely agree with the question that has been placed. COP26 could have been a little bit wider, but that's why we will be focusing on COP27 to make sure we have a system approach in urban mobility. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. I'm glad someone asked that question, right? You're happy about that. I can see that. David Vasco, I'm going to go to you next. David leads our International Climate Initiative. David, you've seen the question. I'm going to read it out for our audience, and it's a very expected question, and I'm happy someone has asked that. So the question is, one major trend is the rise in corporate and financial reporting on climate, nature, and other social issues, alongside with the proliferation of voluntary and mandatory standards. Is this rising volume of corporate reporting sustainable, and will it make the transformational change required? David, this is also connected to a lot of things we saw, both of us at COP, on this idea of greenwashing and how this commitment. Please, David, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Ani. And it's a really excellent question. And I think we saw at Glasgow, even as you just said, an increase even then in significantly in the number of companies and other kinds of actors, other stakeholders that are taking on these kind of commitments, both on the reporting side and in terms of where they're going to go on emissions. Just to give some examples, there are now over 100 financial institutions that have signed up to the Science Based Targets Initiative. 20 of them are now in the target validation phase. We also saw at Glasgow, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero with over 400 financial institutions in that. So this wave continues. And I think really making sure that what companies are doing is robust, that they're doing this in a very serious way. And science-based targets is really an example of the kinds of things that we need. There's some other things that we still need to make happen. One is on the reporting side. For instance, we need to make the reporting standards consistent. There are a lot of them out there. We need to really get consistency across them. And we need to make sure that we're pushing for mandatory reporting requirements as well. We've seen some countries already go in that direction, the UK, for instance, and there's an expectation that the US Securities and Exchange Commission will go in that direction with mandatory reporting requirements soon as well. And then the last thing I'll mention is just something that the UN Secretary General has put in motion that he announced at Glasgow, and that's an expert panel to look at the issue of net zero among this set of actors out there, companies, financial institutions, cities, states, to really come up with a clear set of standards, something consistent for gauging what net zero is and what it means to really get on a net zero trajectory in a real way. So that I think that Secretary General initiative is really helpful in terms of bringing the pieces together and creating a common set of guidelines.
Thank you very much. I think we all are looking forward to the Secretary General initiative on the standards and where we go from there. Thank you very much, David. Wanjira Mathai, I want to go to you next. And Wanjira is Vice President at WRI and leads all our work in Africa. Wanjira, there's a very, very good question. I'm going to ask you two questions, and these will be our two last questions, and you deserve the last word. I'm going to ask one question is, It says, the presentation outlined the importance of leaders and governments turning commitments into action. What might people and individuals have to do in 2022? Wanjira, over to you.
Thanks, Annie. Individuals, and by individuals, I mean all of us across sectors. I think this issue of climate change and climate action in particular requires that we engage, and we engage in ways that help to communicate the issues ahead of us in ways that we have not seen before. Look at those of us in media. Those of us in media must make this an issue of emotion, engagement, and action. So far, what we've seen and so far what we are hearing is a lot of talk, and we are hearing from all the constituencies that we work with that it's just not landing. So our responsibility, all of us, is to engage and to communicate the urgency and the imperative of action across the board.
I couldn't agree with you more, Wanjira. I mean, every story, I think we have a responsibility, each one of us. I really appreciate the question. Wanjira, if I may stick with you, and we just have time for one more question. The question is actually the way forward, and you have engaged a lot already with the Egypt COP, the COP27. You just traveled there. So the question, Wanjira, is that COP27 in Egypt, how do you think it can address climate justice and loss and damage issues, especially for Africa? Wanjira, over to you.
Great question, Annie. It is going to be the big priority for Africa in COP27. The premise really that developed countries being responsible for a majority of the carbon emissions should also provide the financial support for developing countries to help them mitigate and adapt and address loss and damage is going to be the central issue of our time. And if we're honest and if we're committed, this is going to be a great success story, that we come out of COP27 with a financial facility that is addressing how we ensure that those who are suffering today, as you mentioned, Annie, in the presentation, get the sort of support that we need. COP26 gave us, for the very first time, new recognition and a legitimacy for us to discuss loss and damage in a way we had never seen before, turning it around. The framing we must see, therefore, is if we support climate justice, if we are for climate justice, then we must see loss and damage as the injustice of our day. And therefore, COP27 will put this issue front and center.
Thank you so much, Wanjira. I think we have time for one more question. And I really, Ulka, if you're there you are. Ulka Kelkar is the head of our climate group in India, and Ulka works in India on climate. It is such an important country in the conversation going forward. Ulka, if you would reflect a question asked Wanjira, from India's perspective, this COP, India was a very important player, the COP we just had. What does COP27 look like? What do you think is going to happen this year that we all need to be watching for? Ulka, over to you.
So for India in particular, COP26 shone a spotlight on the coal phase down issue, on many of the renewable energy targets for 2030, which are really quite ambitious. What we need to see in this year is finance and implementation of these 2030 targets, which will really lay the foundation for deeper emission cuts in other sectors. What I mean is electric vehicles will run on clean electricity, industry will use cleaner electricity, same with buildings and our cities. So it's really the foundation that is being laid right now, but we need to go much deeper and move towards this net zero target and try to accelerate that. So I think the focus this year is going to be very squarely on implementation and finance.
Thank you very much, Ulka. I think India will continue to play a very important role going forward as it did. We are about out of time. I just want to take this moment to thank all of you for joining us. So many of you joined. This is the biggest audience actually we've had for this event. I also want to thank all of you for the questions you put in. I can promise you that every one of us at WRI will work every morning when we get up to answer the questions you asked us and on the topics we just talked about. So thank you very much for engagement. But as you hear from every story and everything around climate change, it's not about climate change anymore. It's about economy, our lives, our livelihood, our well-being. no one organization can do this. And we have to all work on it together, and we need to work on it together. So we are very much looking forward to engagement. Come and join us, and we want to join you, what you're working on. I really want you to engage with us. Please visit our website. All these resources, questions, and answers will be our website. Also, our hashtag for this is, can you show us the hashtag? Is STW22. Please follow us on that. Use it in Twitter. Before we end, I want to thank our fantastic panel. Thank you all for joining us. It was wonderful to have you. I also want to thank Michael Oko and our whole team that put together this Stories to Watch. It takes a lot of effort to put these stories together. And finally, all our supporters and funders. Without them, WRI won't be WRI. So we cherish your partnership, and the stories that we are the stories for all of us in our community. So thank you very much for your support. And thank you everyone for joining us, and hope we continue together and look forward to the partnership and working together with you. Thanks everyone.